has expired. Senator Humphries.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is to the Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Conroy. I remind the Minister that his own Labor colleagues are quoted today as saying that the government's now dumped anti-discrimination reforms were, quote, a waste of time and, quote, a disaster. Is the Minister aware that the Attorney-General, Mr Dreyfus, on the other hand, has described this bill as just a tidying up of existing anti-discrimination laws? If the Gillard government cannot even get a simple tidying up of legislation right, isn't this just another example of the gross ineptitude and incompetence that's the hallmark of this Labor government?
Order. The Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Conroy.
Thank you, Mr President. Mr President, the Attorney-General today made a very positive announcement that the government will introduce this week legislation to protect Australians against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity and intersex status. This reform is long overdue and too important to be delayed any further. I completely reject the assertion by some in the media and those opposite, and including the Greens, that taking this immediate step somehow constitutes a disavowal of the wider anti-discrimination project or a step back from commitment to protect fundamental human rights. Mr President, for 40 years Labor has promoted principles of fairness and equality by developing the Sex, Disability and Racial Discrimination Acts and creating the Australian Human Rights Commission. We will not roll back these hard-fought protections.
Order.
The fact is, the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee's report on the draft Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Bill recommended significant policy, definitional and technical amendments, along with almost 100 further suggestions from key groups such as the Law Council. These proposals, Mr President, require deeper consideration of how to consolidate 5 bodies of anti-discrimination law into one. It seems that something that we need to get right, which is exactly why we released an early exposure draft, Mr President. In the meantime, these specific new protections take into account feedback from the consultation process on the anti-discrimination bill to ensure the definitions are meaningful and provide the maximum possible protection.
The question. Senator Humphries.
Mr President, will the Minister concede that these now abandoned changes went much further than a simple consolidation of legislation and instead represented a further attempt by the Attorney-General and the government to impose on the Australian people a far-reaching regime of political correctness and to prosecute its anti-free speech agenda?
Order. The Minister.
Mr President, to claim that the government is pursuing an anti-free speech agenda is such rank hypocrisy. Such rank hypocrisy. Yesterday, Mr President, we had a debate and discussion and part of a question time, just like David Cameron, another hater of free speech, just like David Cameron, a Conservative Prime Minister, underpinnings, legislative, press council.
Order.
I apologise, I was distracted by Senator Brandis's interjections.
Resume your seat. Senator Brandis.
The Minister was asked about his legislation, now abandoned. It is not directly relevant to that question to be lecturing the Senate about what the United Kingdom government might be doing with unrelated legislation.
The Minister is addressing the question. The Minister did take an interjection. The interjections are disorderly. I remind the Minister to ignore interjections, and the Minister still has 31 seconds remaining to answer the question. The Minister.
Thank you, Mr President. I mean, those opposite actually support contracts which gag not-for-profit agencies. Put up your hands. Put up your hands and say you won't do it. Put up your hands and stop the gagging of legitimate not-for-profit agencies. Mr President, these new protections build on the government's reforms to 85. Yep, David Cameron and me. That's right, unity ticket. These new protections build on the government's reforms to
Order.
85
Time has
Commonwealth
expired,
Acts.
Senator Conroy. Order. When there's silence, Senator Humphries, you will get the— but you need people on your side to first be quiet, and when there's quiet, we'll proceed. When there's quiet, we'll proceed. Senator Humphries deserves to be heard in silence. Senator Humphries.
Given the government has surrendered on this front in its attack on freedom of speech, will it now abandon its other attack on freedom of speech, namely its plans to muzzle the media?
The order, 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 the order, the minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. That's right, Mr. President. Those opposite talk about muzzling the free press. They talk about a statutory underpinning means that you've muzzled the free press. Well, let's look at what David Cameron and the Conservative Party in the UK have done in the last 24 hours. They have agreed to embed a legislative underpinning for an independent
Order. Senator Conroy, just resume your seat, and when there's silence, I'll give Senator Brandis the call and not before. On my right, when there's silence. Order. Order. On my right. On my left. Senator Brandis.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, once again the point of order goes to relevance. The minister was not asked about British legislation. He was asked about Australian legislation. When you overruled my point of order on the previous supplementary question, I understood you to say that the minister was within the standing orders because he was responding to an interjection. He's not responding to an interjection now.
No, that's
nothing he has said in answer to this question is relevant to Australia.
That is not a point of order. Let me just make one thing. I did not rule the interjection in order. I said the interjection was out of order, and I said the minister should not answer interjections. The minister should ignore interjections. So you shouldn't say something that I didn't say. The minister still has 37 seconds remaining. The minister. To the question.
I have to say that that point of order again demonstrated that those opposite will misrepresent anything. I mean, they stood up and said, Mr. President, I shrunk the question. Suddenly rewrote the question as he stood there when this is a question that he accused the government, the question accuses the government of gagging free speech, on the basis of a statutory underpinning for a press council. And what around the world can we say? Finland. #1 with the Reporters Without Borders. They have a statutory underpinning to their processes. And what do the Reporters Without Borders say?
Order.
The #1
time
free
has expired,
speech country
Senator
in the world.
Conroy. Just resume your seat.